Welcome to Wolfpack Career Chats. My name is Amanda Baright. I am a second-year math and statistics student at NC State, and am currently exploring the practical applications of math and statistics in a way that will help others. Today, I have special guest Kristen Rappazzo with me. Could you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Hi, Amanda. So my name is Kristen Rappazzo. I am an epidemiologist at the US EPA. I study a lot of environmental factors and human health, which is air pollution, pesticides, perfluoroalkyl substances or PFASs, which are an emerging contaminant of concern. I've been getting into more ecosystems, goods and services research, which is connecting things like green space and how the ecological systems can help or be connected to human health. I guess I can do a little bit about my education. I got my PhD from UNC in epidemiology in 2013. Before that, I got my master's in public health and environmental and occupational health from Drexel University, and my undergrad from University of Rochester in brain and cognitive sciences. And in between each of those, I worked at in a neurotox lab, and in between master's and PhD as a program manager for the National Children's Center pilot study in North Carolina.
I'm so glad to have you here today. Wow, you look like you have a really impressive career. I could imagine that didn't happen overnight. For most undergraduates, it seems like we are expected to know what we want to do with our lives immediately after graduation, or have an idea of what direction we want to go. What or who inspired you to pursue your current career?
So originally, before and during undergrad, I actually wanted to be a medical doctor, a psychiatrist. I got my undergrad in brain and cognitive sciences, as I mentioned, and I was really interested in pursuing that avenue of a career. And then I worked as a lab tech, and I did the MCATs, and I applied for medical school, and I got universally rejected from them. Which, looking back, I was like, oh, that was probably one of the best things that could have ever happened to me. And it turns out when you get rejected from medical school, some schools, associated schools, start sending you brochures just because that's how they sell themselves. And I got some brochures for a few different schools of public health, and I didn't even know that public health was a field at the time. This would have been the early 2000s, like very early 2000s, 2002, I think. And I was totally unaware of this as a field. So I started looking into it and being like, oh, this is really interesting. I've always been interested in math and statistics. I like science, which is, good for where I am now. And so I went ahead and applied to a few of the master's programs, and I got into Drexel. And Drexel has a really great community-focused program. It was a really good place to get an MPH and get on-the-ground experience with actual public health workers. I worked with the Childhood Lead Prevention Program of Philadelphia when I was at Drexel, and they were just really great people. I actually got to I shadowed all of the different jobs in the lead prevention program. So I went out and did lead testing in homes. I talked with people about remediation of lead hazards for their children. I did not do the blood sampling of the children, which I'm okay with, but I did do the data analysis for some of that. And then I worked on a program I don't know if they still do, but they had a program called the Lead Court, which was designed to basically be a sort of reminder with some legal force, although they tend not to enact punishments, because the goal is to get people to fix their houses and not to just fine them until they can't own or rent a house anymore. But it was a program that basically had a judge saying you need to do these remediation activities on your house. And that I did an analysis just to show how effective that was in clearing up the backlog of lead hazards in Philadelphia. So I think like working with those people was really wonderful and really was like, yes, this is a thing I want to do. And then, so I was already like, yeah, I was, so sort of, I wasn't necessarily inspired, but sort of happenstanced into it. And then all the people I've met in my career, I shouldn't say all the people, many of the people I've met in my career in public health have been just really wonderful. And like most of them are focused on doing a good job and helping people, even if in their research, which is, it's nice to be able to be like, yeah, I'm doing research, but I'm doing research and I can see what path it will take to help people's lives be healthier. And I've had some really just wonderful mentors. When I first moved down to North Carolina to work as a fellow at the EPA on the children's National Children's Study Pilot Study, my mentor was Pauline Mendola, who was at the EPA then, and now she is currently the chair of epidemiology at SUNY Buffalo. And she is just one of the best people I've ever met. She is an excellent mentor. She's a really great scientist. She does really interesting work. And she has been super supportive of me since I met her, and that was 17 years ago, and we still are in pretty good contact, and she's always been helpful and always like, yes, I would like to work more with Pauline. I'd like to be like Pauline. So I guess Pauline did inspire me. I was just sort of halfway in there already.
I really thought it was interesting, like what you were talking about with the children, like studies, because I know for me, I really love like interacting with kids. Like I down the road, I want to be a math teacher of some sort, like probably high school level math, just because I do really like calculus and like statistics. So I think I would be pretty good AP Stat, AP Calc kind of teacher, especially for like underserved populations. And it seemed like maybe that's kind of like where you were working with like more of underserved areas of the country. So how is it like a difference working with like more children-based studies versus like what you do maybe now that like isn't so much like children-based?
Actually, a lot of my work is still, it's based on, a lot of my work is based on reproductive and birth outcomes. I do other outcomes as like if a study comes up or if the agency requests a certain population to be looked at, I do that. But my background is in children's and reproductive health, so perinatal health. I am much more of a data person, so I don't necessarily I mostly don't interact with people in my scientific work. I get large data sets and I sit on the computer and analyze them. Not as much anymore as I grow in my career, but I have students now that analyze the data for me. So I still do work in that area. It's an area that I'm really interested in. It is an area of big concern. The EPA has the Office of Children's Health Protection because children are a vulnerable population in that they can't control their environment most of the time, and also a susceptible population in that they are actually, if you put an equal amount of air pollution in the air, children will actually take in more of it. They have a higher lung surface area and will basically absorb more pollutants. And they have a higher metabolism, so they have to take in more than adults. And because they're generally shorter, they also get a different, like sometimes there can be a differential based on being closer to the ground. In the lead program, there's also the behavioral stuff where a lot of lead exposure is through lead dust. And so like crawling on the ground, putting stuff in your mouth is one of the major roots of exposure. And that is a thing children do between 1 and 2 just to explore their environment and learn about things. And we're like, oh, please don't. But they won't, they will, because, you know, that's what children do. But yeah, I work a lot in a lot of different populations, but infants and children and developmental health is really one of my areas of interest, and one I hope to keep working on as I go forward.
That's honestly blows my mind like how much you can do with like public health because like for me when I was thinking about public health I only think about the like infectious side of like the epidemiology. So the fact that you can have like epidemiology by training and still be able to do so many other social issues, which is where I am at a crossroads right now because I do really like the humanities. Wow, a STEM girl that loves humanities. It's very, very not common, I think, at least with like the students that I know, because when I mentioned that I was interested in a sociology minor or doing like a global health minor, they were like, wow, that's kind of out there with the math and stats. But I'm glad that I can see that there's like ways to apply the like social aspect of like working with children, working with like reproductive health, which I'm a huge being in Girl Scouts for 13 years. I'm a huge advocate for like women's rights and women's health and like just like being making a better world for our future. And so it's
Mhm.
really interesting to learn about like how you apply your like math and stats like interest into helping others, which is just blows my mind.
And I will just to bounce off your comment, sociology and epidemiology are very closely related. People will absolutely argue about this. People like their silos and they want to be like, no, I'm the most special discipline. And it's like, eh. But sociology, epidemiology, and I think economics, and to some extent, like psychology, are really use very similar tools. Sometimes we have different names for the same thing, which can get very confusing. And there's a different perspective for interpretations, but we use the same math. Like I have one of my epidemiologist friends who works at the CDC. She actually has an undergrad degree in sociology. And then she got her master's in epi, and it's very similar. It's mostly just a perspective thing. And I would say social epidemiology is a big field. People and the EPA included are very concerned about social determinants of health. Things like poverty and racism have a huge impact on people's health, possibly more than almost anything else. And I know everyone is now aware of infectious disease because of the pandemic we are currently living through. Um, and yeah, and epidemiology did start as an infectious disease focus and discipline, and as sort of the general, like as infectious diseases were, I don't, brought under control is the phrase I want to use, but now I'm like, is it though? But in general, like vaccines were developed, techniques, quarantine techniques, and other techniques to control the spread of infectious diseases. They sort of waned in importance for health-related impacts of things like cardiovascular disease and cancer started becoming the major drivers of mortality. Um, so I know Pauline Mandola, who I mentioned earlier, she said when she was in school, everyone was like, oh, infectious diseases, why would you even study that? So everyone was like a cancer epidemiologist. And then the AIDS epidemic happened. And then sort of kind of similar to COVID, where a bunch of people then started being trained in infectious disease epidemiology again because of AIDS and HIV and started studying that. And then as that got into control, it was sort of like, oh, okay, now we can focus on other things. And so for a while, infectious disease epidemiology, one of my coworkers, she said when she was looking for a postdoc in infectious disease epidemiology, and this would have been about 6-ish years ago now, she said it was really hard to find anything. So she ended up coming to work for the EPA because she could translate her skills, which is definitely a nice thing about epidemiology. And then, you know, a couple years ago, it's like, oh, well, if you had applied now, there's tons of postdocs in infectious disease epidemiology right now.
That's definitely good to look forward to for like the future career, like for future generations of freshmen coming into college, not really knowing what they want to do, but having an idea. And so having a peace of mind that there are a wide range of career options available. If you're interested, like I said, in like math and stats or something more basic, where you can then go on to apply what your basic knowledge to something bigger. The next question I wanted to get into really briefly is more on like gender discrimination. So I was wondering, um, how, if you've faced any gender discrimination or misogyny in the workforce, as I mentioned, I'm taking a sociology class, so we're currently talking about gender and genderization of STEM careers. So I was wondering, as someone who works at the EPA, a government agency, if you encounter that, and then how you overcome it, and any advice you have for the next generation of women in STEM.
Yeah, this is a great question. It is really important. I will say I have been really fortunate in that the gender discrimination that I've experienced has mostly been more of the systematic kind. It is the subtle, quiet kind, and not the, oh my God, someone is saying something that is horrifying to me kind. I do know people who have experienced the other, more direct kind. And it is definitely a problem throughout not only science, but I would say lots of different careers, but it's definitely an issue in STEM careers. And it tends to be in STEM more of the what they call the leaky pipeline, where there is sort of this attitude that, oh, girls and young women aren't interested in science, which is not true. The problem is when you get into science, and epidemiology and public health in general are also like this is not as prevalent an issue because they are generally more heavily women and non-binary dominated fields. In If you went into pure math and statistics, which I have several friends in that area as well, it becomes much more male dominated. And there's definitely a lot of attitudes that have persisted over a long period of time that are kind of horrifying. And I have watched people, especially in my sort of secondary experience talking with people and observing, it is the women of color and minority ethnicities who have experienced this more, which is upsetting on a whole different level too. So it is definitely there. And I think I started talking about the leaky pipeline and then didn't describe it because I got on a tangent like I said I would. It is, so you get into STEM and you advance in your career, and you'll notice that as you go higher and higher, there are fewer and fewer women. And so even in epidemiology, it is the methods people are like, oh, that's super fancy. You're developing new methods for people to use. That's great. They're mostly men, not all. I know several women who are like in the higher methods echelons. But if you look at them, the distribution doesn't make a whole lot of sense given the distribution of the field as a whole. And if you look at the speakers at conferences, it's like, there's a lot of men and not a lot of women. That's interesting. Whereas if you look at the people attending the conference, it's like, there are the 10 men. So yeah, it's sort of this, you get there and there are demands, and some of this is if you go into an academic career, the academic lifestyle is a little horrifying in and of itself, just the expectations and the amount of pay and for the level of effort you're expected to put into. It's sort of a 24/7 job, and that can be very, very high stress if you're at R1 Research Institute. And yeah, so you see people be like, well, I want to have a family, which, they should be able to do. And so they make career sacrifices, which men are not necessarily expected to make, or they have a partner making them, so they don't have to. So there's a lot of that sort of, it's not necessarily, it is discrimination, but it's the subtle, systematic, oh, it's always been this way kind of thing. There is also the more direct kind. And in terms of how do you overcome it, it's hard. Again, I said I have been very lucky, and I apparently also give off I will cut you vibe. I have been told I'm very intimidating, which I'm like, I am like 5'4" and very nerdy. I don't know why. And people are just like, yeah, you just seem like you would hurt someone. I was like, I might, I don't know. so I think that's some of it. And I have also apparently give off a I will listen to your problems, which I do, vibe. So people will tell me about what they have experienced. And if you are not the kind, like, if you are lucky enough to be a person who doesn't have to experience this as directly, it is good to be able to listen to people and offer support in whatever way you can. Sometimes the discrimination is coming from higher level people, and if they're not in your direct area and there's no one you can complain to, or if I, for example, am at the EPA and some of the people who come to me are talking about their university situations, it's like I have literally no power in your university, so I can listen to you and make suggestions about maybe who to talk to, uh, and I will absolutely support you in what you want to do, but I can't like go and confront people for you as much as I frequently want to. Um, and within the agency, it can be hard. The government is very bureaucratic, so we have very structured lines to report to. And sometimes the person doing the discrimination is your supervisor. And that's really hard. There are supposed to be people to report to, but everyone is concerned about retaliation, even though that is illegal. I was like, yeah, it doesn't stop people from being terrible though, because if it did, they wouldn't have done the discrimination in the first place. Yeah, and I know I'm rambling, I'm sure, but it's a complicated question. And a lot of it is have a support network that is actually supportive. If you're like, yeah, I feel like this was really bad, and people are like, nah, it's just normal. It's like, it can be normal and also really bad. Like, there are lots of everyday experiences that are very bad. And people are just like, yeah, well, suck it up and deal. And that's not helpful. So don't ever do that, I guess. Like, yeah, I don't know that I have an answer to this. Obviously, I've rambled for a while, and it's hard. Find people who will support you is one way to help. Offer to support other people when you see them going through something. That doesn't necessarily mean go and like confront whoever's doing it, but be like, hey, do you want me to say something to anyone? Do you want me to just be like, I got your back, I see what you're going through? Because that can help people a lot, just to be acknowledged.
Wow. I think I 100% agree with you. I know, like, especially with like high schools, because like I'm still an undergrad, so I'm like still growing in my career, but I definitely support you in that the support systems are probably the most important to have when you're entering into a career, and like developing a strong support system right off the bat. So that way you have each other's back, even if it is a mixed gendered support system. Like just having people that have your back is probably the most important thing when you're starting out a career, I would say. So definitely keep that in mind for the listeners at home, and try and find when you get into your career a support system of your own that you can have as a family at the workplace and outside, because work-life balance is very important as well. My last question I wanted to ask you today is, if you're in a time machine in the year 2042, what is some advice you would give yourself today in 2022?
I was hoping we wouldn't get to this question.
Think of
One,
it as like general advice, maybe
yeah,
just like general
I was like,
advice.
I'm terrible at the hypotheticals because I'm always like, now is that realistic? And so, so a lot of it is in 2042. I don't know what the world's gonna look like. I don't know who I'm gonna be. I could be a totally different person. Like I'm a very different person than I was 20 years ago. Not entirely, like, but I've gotten you as you get older. I've gotten more comfortable in myself, and being and just the phrase I want to say I'm not going to say because it involves a swear word, and I'm going to try to be appropriate during work hours on your podcast. But I have learned to not take to heart the things that other people are doing that don't actually affect me. Is like, okay, I don't really need to acknowledge your attitude if it's not impactful on me, and if like I am okay with what I'm doing and I'm not hurting anyone, that is important. So I'm gonna say I would say be confident in your choices. Um, Saying no to more things is something I would tell myself now. It's like advice from current me to current me is please say no to more things. I have an issue where I'm like, oh, that's an interesting project. I do want to be a part of it. Thank you for asking me. And I'm like, I have said yes to far too many people. I need to start saying no, even if it is interesting. I can politely say no and be like, please keep me in mind for the future. Um, but it's easy to get overwhelmed, even with stuff you enjoy. Uh, so I'm gonna say it's okay to say no to more stuff and to relax a little more. Like as you said, work-life balance is very important, and it's really easy to tip that over, especially so in a government job, you work your working hours and then you stop. That is one of the things I like about being in a government job. Working from home, it's harder to, that line is a little blurrier because I was in the office and I did work, and then when I left the office I did not do work, because that is the legal rule, which is not always the case for other types of scientific research careers, but it is in the government. And being at home, working from home, which I do actually really enjoy because I like not commuting, it is sometimes hard to be like, oh, this is my time. But I'm like, oh, but I'm actually in a really good place writing. So I'm going to just keep doing it for a while. Or it's like, oh, I'll just read one more article. And so it can bleed into you a little bit. So I was like, stop what you're doing. Be like, keep your time separated and try to have that separation of work life. Don't say yes to every project that comes across your desk, even if you're super interested in it, because you will run out of time and then you'll just be tired and burnt out. And that's no help to anybody.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story and joining me on this podcast today. It's been wonderful hearing about how you got rejected from medical school, but then turned that around and found a passion in a field that is actually helping, maybe in my opinion, more people than just going to med school. Because you're, like you were saying earlier in the podcast, you are working with children, you're working with female reproductive issues, and looking at all these complicated sociological and epidemiological issues that merge together. And so seeing that connection between all these different STEM and humanities fields has been really insightful for listeners at home and for me. And also hearing about your discussion with the Leaky pipeline and the systematic and bureaucratic way that is still prevalent in society, even though we keep trying to work at it. And I don't know when that's going to necessarily stop, but like you said, the support system is, I think, probably the most important thing that we can have. And trying to find your family at home and at work will be probably the most key success for a successful career in your future. Well, that's all we have. Have a great rest of your day.